The dust rose in choking clouds around the makeshift platform that had been erected in the center of Wyatt, Missouri. And Grace Sullivan stood upon it, with her head held high despite the shame burning through her veins like wildfire. The September sun of 1878 beat down mercilessly as men gathered around the platform, their eyes assessing her worth like she was nothing more than a mare at a livestock auction. Her father had been dead 3 weeks now, buried in a pauper's grave after his gambling debts had consumed everything they owned, and the creditors had wasted no time in claiming what they believed was owed to them. She was 20 years old, and this was how her life had come to such a brutal crossroads. "Gentlemen, we'll start the bidding at $50, announced Warren Grimshaw, the man who held the largest portion of her father's debts. He was a saloon owner with greasy hair and a smile that made Grace's skin crawl. "This here's a healthy young woman, good for cooking, cleaning, and whatever else a man might need." The crowd of men laughed, and Grace felt her cheeks burn hotter. She scanned the faces below her, seeing ranchers she had known all her life, drifters passing through town, and merchants who had once tipped their hats to her respectfully on the street. Now they looked at her like property, and the reality of what was about to happen settled over her like a suffocating blanket. $50, called out a voice from the back. 60, countered another man closer to the platform. Grace's hands trembled where she held them clasped in front of her worn calico dress. This morning, she had braided her chestnut hair with shaking fingers, wondering who would own her by sunset. The thought made bile rise in her throat, but she had nowhere to run. Grimshaw had made it clear that if she fled, he would have the law hunt her down, and the punishment would be far worse than whatever awaited her with a new master. $75, shouted a portly merchant who owned the general store. Grace knew he had buried 2 wives already, worked them to death in his store and his home. The bidding continued, climbing higher, and with each increase, Grace felt her future slipping further from her control. She thought of her mother, dead these past 5 years from fever, and wondered what she would think seeing her only daughter sold like chattel in the town square. Then a voice cut through the crowd, deep and steady, and carrying an authority that made several men turn around to look. $500. The crowd fell silent. Grace's eyes snapped to the source of the voice, and she saw a tall man pushing his way through the gathered bidders. He wore a dusty black hat, weathered leather chaps over denim pants, and a blue shirt that had seen better days. A gun belt sat low on his hips, the revolver well maintained but not flashy. His face was tanned from years under the sun, with a strong jaw covered in a few days' worth of stubble, and eyes so intensely blue they seemed to cut through the dust-filled air between them. 500. Grimshaw sputtered, his expression shifting from shock to greed in an instant. "Well now, that's a serious bid. Anyone care to top it?" the crowd murmured, but no one spoke up. $500 was more than most of these men made in half a year. The cowboy stood with his arms crossed, his gaze never leaving Grace's face, and she found herself unable to look away from him. There was something in his expression she could not quite read, but it was not the same hunger she saw in the other men's eyes. 500 going once, Grimshaw called out, practically salivating at the windfall. Going twice. He paused dramatically. Sold to the stranger for $500. The cowboy moved forward, pulling a thick roll of bills from inside his shirt. Grace watched in disbelief as he counted out the money and handed it to Grimshaw, who examined each bill with eager fingers before nodding in satisfaction. "She's all yours, mister. What did you say your name was?" "I did not say," the cowboy replied curtly. He turned to Grace and extended his hand to help her down from the platform. "Madam, Grace hesitated for only a moment before placing her hand in his. His palm was calloused and warm, his grip steady as he guided her down the steps. The crowd was already beginning to disperse. Their entertainment concluded, and Grimshaw was tucking the money into his vest with a satisfied expression. "Come on," the cowboy said quietly, his hand at her elbow as he steered her away from the platform and toward the edge of town, where a beautiful black horse stood tethered to a post. Grace's mind raced. She had been prepared for the worst, and now she had been bought by a complete stranger who had just spent a small fortune on her. "Who are you?" she finally managed to ask, her voice hoarse from hours of standing silent in the sun. "Name's Quentin Parker," he said, untying his horse's reins. "And you do not need to look so frightened. I am not going to hurt you." "Then, what do you want with me?" Grace demanded, finding some of her courage returning now that they were away from the leering crowd. Men do not spend $500 without expecting something in return. Quentin turned to face her fully and up close. She could see the fine lines around his eyes, the weathered quality of a man who had spent his life outdoors. He looked to be perhaps 26 or 27, still young, but with an air of experience that added years to his bearing. "I expect nothing," he said simply. "You are free to go wherever you want." Grace stared at him, certain she had misheard. "What? You are free," he repeated, his blue eyes steady on hers. "I did not buy you to own you, I bought you to free you." No one should be sold like that, no matter what debts their father owed. The words hit Grace like a physical blow, and suddenly her knees felt weak. "I do not understand. You just spent $500 to set me free." "That is right." Quentin turned back to his horse, checking the saddle. "You have family somewhere, friends who can take you in." Grace shook her head slowly, the shock still washing over her. "No, my mother is dead, my father just buried, I have no one." Quentin was quiet for a moment, his hand resting on his horse's neck. "You have skills. Can you read and write?" "Yes," Grace said. "My mother taught me. I can cook, so keep house. I worked at the hotel before my father died, helping in the kitchen." "Then you will find work somewhere," Quentin said. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small leather pouch. "Here. This should be enough to get you started in a new town. Pay for a stage-coach ticket and a few weeks' room and board while you find employment." He held out the pouch, and Grace took it automatically, feeling the weight of coins inside. Her hands were shaking again, but this time not from fear. "Why are you doing this? You do not even know me." Quentin met her eyes, and she saw something dark and painful flicker across his face before he shuddered it away. "Let us just say I know what it is like to be powerless. I made some money on a cattle drive, and I figured I could do some good with it. Seemed like you needed help." Grace clutched the pouch to her chest, overwhelmed by the kindness of this stranger. Men did not do things like this, not in her experience. Every man she had ever known wanted something, expected something. Her father had been a charming drunk who had gambled away everything her mother had worked for. The men who had gathered today had looked at her with calculating eyes, measuring what they could get from her. But this cowboy, this Quentin Parker, was offering her freedom with no strings attached. "I do not know what to say," she whispered. "You do not have to say anything." Quentin turned back to his horse. "The eastbound stage comes through tomorrow morning. You should be on it." He moved to mount his horse, and panic suddenly flared in Grace's chest. He was leaving this strange guardian angel who had appeared out of nowhere, and she would never see him again. The thought left her feeling oddly hollow. "Wait," she called out, stepping forward. "Where are you going?" Quentin paused with one foot in the stirrup. "Got a job waiting for me at her ranch about 2 days' ride from here. The Double Bar. Could they use another worker?" The words tumbled out before Grace could stop them. "I can earn my keep. I am not afraid of hard work." Quentin turned to look at her, his expression unreadable. "Why would you want to do that? I just gave you money to start fresh somewhere new." Grace swallowed hard, trying to articulate feelings she did not fully understand herself. "Because everywhere else, I will just be the girl who was auctioned off in Wyatt. The shame will follow me. But if I go with you to a place where no one knows me, I can start truly fresh. I can work and build a new life." She paused, then added more quietly, "And because you are the first person in a very long time who has shown me genuine kindness. I would like to know you better, if that is acceptable." Something shifted in Quentin's expression, a softening around his eyes. He studied her for a long moment, and Grace felt her breath catch in her throat as she waited for his answer. "It is hard work at a ranch," he finally said. "Long hours, rough conditions." "I am not afraid of hard work," Grace repeated firmly. Quentin nodded slowly. "All right then. But you ride on the horse with me, and I am taking you as a fellow worker, not as anyone's property. You will be paid proper wages, same as any hand." Relief flooded through Grace. "Thank you. Come on then. We should put some miles between us and this town before sunset." Quentin mounted his horse and extended his hand down to her. "You ever ridden before?" "A few times when I was younger." Grace took his hand and let him pull her up behind him. She settled onto the horse's back, very aware of how close she was to this stranger, how she had to hold onto him to keep her balance. He smelled of leather and sage and horses, not unpleasant. "Hold on tight," Quentin said, and nudged the horse into a walk. They rode out of Wyatt as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the horizon. Grace did not look back at the town where she had spent her entire life. There was nothing there for her anymore, except painful memories and shame. Instead, she focused on the broad shoulders of the man in front of her, this mysterious cowboy who had changed her fate with a single bid. As they rode, the landscape opened up around them, rolling hills covered in prairie grass that swayed in the wind like waves on a golden ocean. The September air was still warm but carried the first hints of the autumn to come. Grace had rarely left Wyatt in her 20 years, and seeing the vast openness of the Missouri countryside filled her with a strange mixture of fear and exhilaration. "Can I ask you something?" she ventured after they had been riding for perhaps an hour. "Sure." "How did you come to have so much money to spend on a stranger?" Quentin was quiet for a moment. "Spent 5 months driving cattle from Texas to Kansas. It was brutal work. Lost several men along the way to stampedes and river crossings. But those of us who made it through got paid well. I have been saving for a while now, hoping to buy my own piece of land someday." "And you just spent a large portion of it on me," Grace said, guilt twisting in her stomach. "I have taken your dream from you." "No," Quentin said firmly. "I chose to spend it that way. Some things are more important than land. Besides, I will earn more. The double bar pays good wages for men willing to work hard." They rode in silence for a while longer, and as the sun sank lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Quentin guided his horse off the main trail toward a cluster of cottonwood trees near a small creek. "We will camp here for the night," he announced, dismounting and then helping Grace down. Her legs were shaky from the ride, muscles protesting the unfamiliar position. "I can help set up camp," she offered. "You know how to start a fire?" "Yes." "Then you gather kindling while I tend to the horse." They worked in companionable silence, Grace collecting dry twigs and grass while Quentin unsaddled his horse and led the animal to the creek to drink. By the time darkness fell, they had a small fire crackling, and Quentin had produced jerky and hardtack from his saddlebags for dinner. It was not much, but Grace ate gratefully, realizing she had not had anything since a meager breakfast that morning. They sat on opposite sides of the fire, and in its flickering light, She studied Quentin's face more carefully. He had a strong profile, a straight nose that looked like it might have been broken once and healed slightly crooked, and those startling blue eyes that seemed to reflect the flames. "You said you know what it is like to be powerless," Grace said softly. "What did you mean by that?" Quentin's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he would not answer. Then he let out a long breath. "My mother was Cherokee. My father was a white trapper who stayed with her tribe for a few years. When I was 8, soldiers came and forced the remaining Cherokee out of Missouri, part of the removal policies. My mother died on that march. My father was not there, had gone off trapping and never came back. I ended up in an orphanage in St. Louis where they tried to beat the Indian out of me." Grace's heart clenched at the pain in his voice. "I am so sorry," Quentin shrugged, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. "It was a long time ago. I ran away when I was 12, made my way west, worked whatever jobs I could find. Learned to ride and rope, became a cowboy. It is a hard life, but it is mine. No one owns me. No one tells me who I have to be." "Is that why you bought me?" "Because you understand what it is like to have your choices taken away." "Partly." Quentin poked at the fire with a stick. "Also because it was the right thing to do. I looked up at that platform and saw you standing there, proud even though you were terrified, and I thought about my mother. How she must have felt being forced from her home, watching her people die. Sometimes we have the chance to prevent suffering, and if we do not take that chance, what does that make us?" Grace felt tears prick at her eyes. "It makes you a better man than any I have known." Quentin looked at her across the fire, and something passed between them in that moment, a connection that went beyond words. "Tell me about your family," he said. "What were they like before the debts?" Grace hesitated, then began to speak. She told him about her mother, a strong woman who had taken in laundry and sewing to make ends meet, who had taught Grace to read using an old Bible and whatever newspapers she could find. She told him about how her father had been charming and funny when sober, how he had made her mother laugh, but how the drinking and gambling had slowly consumed him until there was nothing left but debt and broken promises. "He died in a card game," she said quietly. "Someone accused him of cheating and there was a fight. He hit his head on the table going down and never woke up. They buried him the next day, and before the week was out, Grimshaw and the others came to collect what he owed. They took our house, the furniture, my mother's wedding ring. When there was nothing left to take, Grimshaw said I would have to work off the debt. But then he got the idea to auction me instead, said he could get more money that way." "That man is a vulture," Quentin said with disgust. "He is a businessman," Grace replied bitterly. "And in this world, that makes him respectable while I am just the daughter of a drunk, worth whatever someone will pay." "You are worth more than any amount of money," Quentin said, his voice intense. "Do not ever let anyone tell you different." The conviction in his words warmed something deep inside Grace's chest. She had spent the last 3 weeks feeling worthless, feeling like her life had no value beyond what it could earn for her father's creditors. But this stranger, this cowboy with sad eyes and a kind heart, saw her as a person. It was a gift more precious than the money in the pouch at her waist. As the fire burned down to embers, Quentin gave Grace his bedroll and insisted she take it, saying he had slept on the ground plenty of times. She protested, but he was adamant, and finally she wrapped herself in the blanket and lay down near the dying fire. Quentin settled on the other side, using his saddle as a pillow, his hat pulled low over his eyes. "Quentin," Grace called softly into the darkness. "Yeah, thank you. For everything." There was a pause, then his voice came back, rough with emotion. "You are welcome, Grace. Now get some sleep. We have a long ride tomorrow." Grace closed her eyes, but sleep was slow to come. Her mind raced with everything that had happened, how her life had been irrevocably changed in the span of a single afternoon. She thought about the platform, the leering men, the humiliation that had burned through her. And then she thought about Quentin's hand reaching out to help her down, his steady voice telling her she was free. She had expected to end this day as some man's property, and instead, she was lying under the stars with hope blooming tentatively in her chest. When she finally drifted off, she dreamed not of the past but of the future, of wide open spaces and possibilities she had never dared imagine. The next morning, they rose with the sun and continued their journey. The landscape gradually shifted from the rolling hills of central Missouri to rougher terrain as they headed northwest. Quentin proved to be an easy traveling companion, pointing out landmarks and wildlife, teaching her the names of different plants they passed. He showed her which grasses the horses preferred, how to read the sky for coming weather, how to spot a deer trail in the brush. "You know so much about the land," Grace observed as they paused to let the horse drink from a stream on the second day. "You learn quick when your survival depends on it," Quentin replied. "Besides, I like being out here. Cities make me feel trapped." "I have never been anywhere but Wyatt," Grace admitted. "My mother always talked about going to St. Louis someday, seeing the big city, but we never had the money." "Cities are overrated," Quentin said. "Too many people, too much noise. Give me a clear sky and open prairie any day." As they rode, Grace found herself relaxing into Quentin's presence. He did not talk much, but when he did, his words were thoughtful and genuine. He treated her with respect, never once making her feel like she owed him anything for what he had done. And slowly, she began to notice other things about him. The way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, which was rare but genuine. The quiet strength in how he moved, economical and sure. The gentleness in his hands when he tended to his horse. They reached the Double Bar Ranch late in the afternoon of the third day. The ranch was bigger than Grace had expected, with a large main house, several outbuildings and extensive corrals holding dozens of horses and cattle. A weathered sign hung over the entrance gate, the brand burned deep into the wood. Quentin rode up to the main house and dismounted, helping Grace down before walking up to knock on the door. It was opened by a woman in her 40s with graying brown hair pulled back in a practical bun and shrewd but kind eyes. "You must be Parker," she said, looking Quentin up and down. "My husband said you would be arriving soon. I am Martha Preston." "Madam," Quentin touched the brim of his hat respectfully, "this is Grace Sullivan. She is looking for work as well if you have need of another hand." Martha's eyes shifted to Grace, taking in her worn dress and tired face. "Can you cook?" "Yes, madam. And clean, so tend a garden. Our previous cook left last month to get married, and I have been trying to feed 20 ranch hands by myself. You are hired if you want the job. Room and board plus $15 a month." Grace's eyes widened. $15 was more than she had made at the hotel. "Yes, madam. Thank you. Good. Come on inside and I will show you where you will be staying. Parker, the bunkhouse is out behind the barn. Foreman's name is Dutch. He will get you settled." Quentin nodded, then turned to Grace. "Seems like things are working out." "Thanks to you," Grace said softly. She wanted to say more to express the depth of her gratitude, but Martha was waiting, and men were starting to emerge from the bunkhouse, curious about the new arrivals. "I will see you around," Quentin said, and there was something in his eyes that made Grace's heart skip. "Yes," she managed. "I hope so." Martha led Grace into the house, showing her a small but clean room off the kitchen that would be hers. It had a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window looking out over the prairie. After 3 weeks of uncertainty and fear, having her own space again felt like an unimaginable luxury. "You look dead on your feet," Martha observed. Rest for an hour, then come help me with supper. The hands eat at 6. Grace nodded gratefully and sank onto the bed as soon as Martha left. She lay there, staring at the ceiling, and let the reality of her new situation wash over her. She was safe. She had a job. She had a place to sleep and food to eat. And somewhere outside, Quentin Parker was settling into the bunkhouse, the man who had given her all of this, asking nothing in return. She wondered what it would be like, seeing him every day, working on the same ranch. The thought made something flutter in her chest, something she was not quite ready to name. That evening, Grace helped Martha prepare an enormous meal of beef stew, biscuits, and dried apple pie for the ranch hands. When the dinner bell rang, men began filing into the large dining hall attached to the main house, their voices loud and boisterous after a long day of work. Grace stayed in the kitchen, helping Martha serve, and tried not to search the faces for Quentin. But she saw him anyway, coming in near the end of the line. He had cleaned up some, his face freshly washed and his hair damp. He met her eyes as he took his plate and gave her a small nod that somehow felt significant. The meal was well received, the men complimenting the food loudly, and Martha beamed with relief at having help again. As Grace cleaned up afterward, Martha chatted about the ranch, explaining how it worked, who the various hands were, what the daily routine looked like. "That Parker fellow seems decent," Martha commented as they washed dishes. "My husband says he came highly recommended from the trail boss on the last cattle drive, says he is one of the best horsemen he has seen." "He is a good man," Grace said quietly. Martha gave her a knowing look. "He the one who helped you out of whatever trouble you were in?" Grace hesitated, then nodded. There was no point in lying, and something about Martha invited honesty. "Figured it was something like that. You both had that look, like you were running from something." Martha dried a pot and hung it on the wall. "Well, you are safe here. Mr. Preston runs a respectable operation, and he does not tolerate any foolishness from the hands. You have any trouble from any of them, you come straight to me." "Thank you, Mrs. Preston. Call me Martha. We will be working too close for formalities." Over the following weeks, Grace settled into a rhythm at the double bar. She rose before dawn to start breakfast, worked through the day preparing meals, doing laundry, mending clothes, tending the kitchen garden. It was hard work, but it was honest work, and every night she went to bed tired but satisfied, and every day she saw Quentin. Sometimes just briefly when he came in for meals with the other hands. Sometimes longer, when he happened to be working near the house, and she brought out water or coffee to the men. They did not speak much beyond polite greetings, but Grace was always aware of his presence, drawn to him in a way she did not fully understand. She learned more about him by watching and listening. The other hands respected him, she noticed, despite him being relatively new. He worked hard, never complained, and had a way with the horses that bordered on magical. She heard stories about how he had broken a particularly wild Mustang that no one else could handle, how he had stayed up all night with a mare having a difficult birth, and saved both the mother and foal. One evening, about a month after arriving at the ranch, Grace was sitting on the porch of the main house, taking a rare moment to rest, when Quentin came walking up from the barn. He saw her and hesitated, then seemed to make a decision and approached. "Evening," he said, stopping at the bottom of the porch steps. "Evening," Grace replied, setting aside the shirt she had been mending. Her heart had sped up at his approach, and she felt suddenly self-conscious. "You settling in all right?" "Yes." "Martha is wonderful to work with, and the work is good." Quentin nodded, shifting his weight. He seemed almost nervous, which was strange for a man usually so steady. "I wanted to check on you, make sure everything was working out like I hoped." "It is better than I ever could have imagined," Grace said honestly. "I owe you so much." "You do not owe me anything," Quentin said firmly. "I told you that, I know, but I still feel grateful." Grace paused, gathering her courage. "Would you like to sit for a moment? Or do you need to get back to the bunkhouse?" Quentin glanced back toward the barn, then up at her. "I can sit for a bit." He climbed the steps and settled onto the porch bench, leaving a respectful distance between them. For a moment, they sat in silence, watching the sun set over the prairie in a blaze of orange and purple. "It is beautiful here," Grace said softly. "Yeah," Quentin agreed. "Reminds me a bit of where my mother's people lived before the removal. She used to talk about the hills and the rivers, how the land provided everything they needed if you knew how to listen to it. You must miss her terribly." "Every day." Quentin's voice was rough. "But time makes it easier. You learn to carry the grief instead of letting it carry you." Grace thought about her own mother, about the hole her death had left. "I understand that." They fell into conversation then, easier than before, talking about their days, sharing stories. Quentin told her about a calf that had gotten stuck in a fence that morning and the elaborate rescue that had ensued. Grace told him about Martha's ongoing battle with a family of mice that kept getting into the pantry. It was comfortable, sitting there with him as darkness fell, and Grace realized she felt more at peace than she had in years. This became their routine. Every few evenings, Quentin would find a reason to pass by the main house when Grace was taking her evening rest, and they would sit and talk. Sometimes for just a few minutes, sometimes for an hour or more. Grace learned about his years working ranches across Kansas and Missouri, about the cattle drives and trail towns. She told him about her childhood in Wyatt, the stories her mother had told her, her dreams of someday having a small house and a garden of her own. As the weeks turned into months, Grace became aware that her feelings for Quentin were deepening into something more than gratitude or friendship. She found herself looking for him throughout the day, her heart lifting when she caught sight of him working in the corrals. She treasured their evening conversations, memorizing the sound of his voice, the way his eyes softened when he looked at her. She thought about what it would be like to touch his hand, to feel his arms around her. The realization both thrilled and terrified her. After what she had been through, the thought of belonging to any man made her stomach turn. But Quentin was different. He had proven that from the first moment, and everything since had only reinforced it. He was kind, respectful, genuine. He saw her as a person, not property. And the way he looked at her sometimes with an intensity that made her breath catch, suggested his feelings might be growing too. Winter arrived, bringing cold winds and occasional snow. The ranch work became harder, with ice to break on water troughs and animals to keep sheltered. Grace spent long hours in the warm kitchen, cooking hearty meals to keep the hands fed and strong. Quentin was often gone for days at a time, riding the far ranges to check on cattle, and Grace was surprised by how much she missed him during those absences. It was a bitter cold evening in late January when everything changed. Grace was cleaning up after supper when she heard a commotion outside. She rushed to the window and saw several hands supporting a figure between them, helping him toward the bunkhouse. Even from a distance, she recognized Quentin's black hat. Her heart in her throat, she grabbed her shawl and ran outside, not caring about the cold or propriety. She reached the bunkhouse just as they were helping Quentin inside. His face was pale, his leg bloody. "What happened?" she demanded. "Horse spooked and threw him into some rocks," one of the hands explained. "Gashed his leg pretty bad. Get him on a bed." "I need hot water and clean cloth," Grace ordered, her training from helping her mother tend injuries taking over. She might have just been a cook, but in an emergency, she would do what was needed. They laid Quentin on a bunk, and Grace carefully cut away his pant leg to examine the wound. It was deep but clean, running along his thigh. He would need stitches. "This is going to hurt," she told him, meeting his eyes. "I have had worse," Quentin said through gritted teeth, but his face was tight with pain. Grace worked quickly and efficiently, cleaning the wound, stitching it closed with steady hands despite the way her heart was pounding. Quentin bore it stoically, only the whiteness of his knuckles where he gripped the bed frame showing his discomfort. When she finally tied off the last stitch and bandaged his leg, she let out a shaky breath. "You did good," one of the older hands said appreciatively. "Better than most doctors I have seen." "My mother was a healer of sorts," Grace explained, sitting back. "She taught me what she knew." The other hands drifted away, giving them space, and Grace looked down at Quentin. His color was better now, the initial shock wearing off. "You need to stay off that leg for at least a week," she told him firmly. "And the stitches need to stay clean and dry." "Yes, madam," Quentin said, a faint smile crossing his face despite the pain. "Guess I will be spending some time in the bunkhouse." "I will bring your meals to you," Grace said, "and check the wound twice a day to make sure it is healing properly." "You do not have to do that." "Yes, I do." Grace's voice was fierce. "You saved me. The least I can do is make sure you heal properly." Something flickered in Quentin's eyes, and he reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. When she did not, he took her hand in his. His palm was warm and rough, his grip gentle. "Grace, I need to tell you something." Her heart was beating so hard she was sure he could hear it. "What?" "These past months, getting to know you, they have been the best of my life. I look forward to seeing you every day. I think about you when I am out on the range. And I know I have no right to feel this way, that you might not want anything to do with men after what you went through, but I cannot keep it to myself anymore." He paused, his blue eyes intense on hers. "I am falling in love with you." The words hung in the air between them, and Grace felt tears spring to her eyes. "Quentin, you do not have to say anything," he interrupted quickly. "I just needed you to know. No matter what you feel or do not feel, it does not change anything. You do not owe me anything." "Hush," Grace said, squeezing his hand. "You are always saying I do not owe you anything, but that is not why I feel the way I do." She took a shaky breath. "I am falling in love with you too. I have been for weeks now, maybe from the beginning. You are the kindest, most honorable man I have ever known. You gave me back my life, my freedom, my hope. How could I not love you?" Quentin's face transformed, joy breaking across it like sunrise. "Grace, truly, truly." She smiled through her tears. "But I am also terrified. The last time I trusted a man with my future, it ended with me on an auction platform." "I know," Quentin said softly, "and I understand if you need time. I am not going anywhere. I will wait as long as you need." Grace looked at their joined hands, at this man who had charged into her life like a hero from one of the dime novels she had read as a girl. But he was not perfect or invincible. He was real, flawed, and human. He had been hurt and had survived. He understood pain and powerlessness. And he was offering her not ownership but partnership, not demands but patience. "I do not want to wait," she heard herself say. "I have spent enough of my life being afraid. You make me feel brave." Quentin lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently, his eyes never leaving hers. "Then we will be brave together." Over the next week, while Quentin recovered, Grace visited him several times a day, bringing meals, checking his wound, and sitting to talk with him. The other hands teased them good-naturedly, but there was genuine happiness in their comments. Everyone could see how well-suited Grace and Quentin were, how they balanced each other. Martha noticed too, and one morning while they were preparing breakfast, she gave Grace a knowing smile. "That Parker is a good man. I am happy for you both." Grace felt her cheeks warm. Is it that obvious? Only to anyone with eyes, dear. The way he looks at you like you hung the moon, and you light up whenever he is around. It is sweet. By the time Quentin was back on his feet and returning to work, winter was beginning to loosen its grip on the land. The days grew longer, and the first hints of spring appeared in the greening grass and budding trees. Quentin and Grace were openly courting now, spending every free moment together. He taught her to ride better, taking her out on gentle horses to explore the ranch land. She shared her love of reading with him, discovering he could read well despite his rough education, and they spent evenings reading to each other from the few books in the ranch library. One warm evening in April, Quentin asked Grace to take a walk with him after supper. They strolled away from the ranch buildings, out to where the prairie stretched endlessly under a sky painted in sunset colors. When they were alone, Quentin stopped and turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "Grace Sullivan, I have been thinking about how to say this for weeks now, trying to find the perfect words. But there are no perfect words, so I am just going to speak from my heart." He paused, his blue eyes earnest. "I love you more than I thought it was possible to love another person. You are strong and brave and kind. You make me laugh. You make me want to be a better man. I want to spend the rest of my life with you if you will have me. Will you marry me?" Grace's eyes filled with tears, but they were happy tears. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." Quentin pulled her into his arms, and she went willingly, wrapping her arms around his neck. When he kissed her, it was gentle and sweet and full of promise. Grace felt like her heart would burst with joy. Less than a year ago, she had stood on a platform, being sold like property, her future bleak and hopeless. And now she stood in the arms of a man who loved her, who respected her, who wanted to build a life with her as an equal partner. They married a month later in a simple ceremony at the ranch, with Martha and Mr. Preston standing as witnesses and all the ranch hands in attendance. Grace wore a simple blue dress that Martha had helped her make, and Quentin wore his best shirt and a new vest. They spoke their vows under a clear sky, promising to love and honor each other for all their days. Mr. Preston offered them one of the lined shacks on the far edge of the ranch property, a small cabin that had been used for sheltering hands during winter range work, but was currently empty. It was not much, just 3 rooms and a loft, but it was theirs. Together they fixed it up, patching the roof, sealing the walls against drafts, building simple furniture. Grace planted a garden and Quentin built a chicken coop. It was hard work, but they did it together, and that made all the difference. Quentin continued working as a ranch hand, while Grace still helped Martha with cooking several days a week, but now they had their own home to return to each night. Grace had never been happier. She loved their little cabin, loved the life they were building together. Quentin was everything she could have hoped for in a husband and more. He was patient and kind, working alongside her as a true partner. He listened to her opinions, valued her thoughts, and made her feel cherished every single day. As the seasons turned and their first year of marriage passed, Grace found herself pregnant. The news filled her with both joy and terror. Childbirth had killed many women she had known, including a cousin when Grace was just a girl. But Quentin held her close and promised he would be by her side through it all. Martha proved invaluable, having birthed 6 children of her own and coached Grace through the pregnancy. When the time came in the early spring of 1880, Martha and the local midwife attended Grace through a long but ultimately safe labor. Quentin paced outside the cabin, and when Martha finally emerged to tell him he had a healthy son, he burst into the cabin to find Grace exhausted but smiling, holding a small bundle. "Come meet your son," she said softly. Quentin approached almost reverently, looking down at the tiny red face of his child. "He is perfect," he whispered in awe. "What should we name him?" Grace asked. They had discussed names, but Quentin had said the final choice should be Grace's. She looked at her husband, at the wonder and love on his face, and made her decision. "Thomas, after your father." Quentin's eyes filled with tears. His relationship with his absent father was complicated, but Grace knew he held on to hope that maybe one day they would meet again. "Are you sure?" "I am sure. Thomas Parker." Quentin kissed her forehead gently. "Thank you. For him, for you, for this life. You have given me everything I never knew I needed." The years that followed were good ones, though not without their hardships. Ranch life was never easy, and there were seasons of drought, harsh winters, and the constant work that came with raising cattle and horses. But Grace and Quentin faced it all together, their love deepening with each passing year. Thomas grew into a sturdy, curious boy with his father's blue eyes and his mother's chestnut hair. 2 years after his birth, Grace delivered a daughter they named Caroline, and 3 years after that, another son they called James. The little cabin grew crowded, and with Mr. Preston's blessing and some of the money Quentin had saved, they expanded it, adding 2 more rooms and a proper porch. Grace continued to help Martha occasionally, but most of her time was spent raising their children and maintaining their home. She taught all 3 to read and write, just as her mother had taught her, determined that they would have the education she valued so highly. Quentin taught them to ride and care for animals, passing on the skills that had sustained him. In the summer of 1887, nearly 9 years after that fateful day in Wyatt, a stranger rode up to their cabin. Grace was hanging laundry while the children played nearby, and she tensed at the unfamiliar figure. But Quentin emerged from the barn and approached the man, and after a brief conversation, his body language changed. He brought the stranger to the cabin, and Grace saw that tears were streaming down her husband's face. "Grace," Quentin said, his voice shaking, "this is my father, Thomas Parker." Grace's hand flew to her mouth. The man was older, grizzled, but she could see the resemblance in the set of his jaw, the shape of his eyes. He looked weary and sad, his clothes worn from hard travel. "I have been looking for you for 15 years, Thomas said to Quentin, his voice rough with emotion. "Ever since I came back and found your mother gone, the tribe scattered and you vanished. I have searched everywhere." A hand at the double bar mentioned a Quentin Parker, and I had to know if it was you. What followed were hours of explanation, of painful revelations and tentative reconciliation. Thomas had not abandoned them as Quentin had always believed. He had been injured on his trap line, caught by an early blizzard, and by the time he recovered and made it back, the forced removal had already happened. He had spent years searching for any trace of his son, never giving up hope. It was hard for Quentin, confronting the father he had resented for so long, learning that his abandonment had been circumstance rather than choice. But Grace stood beside him, and together they navigated this unexpected reunion. Eventually, Thomas became a part of their lives, a grandfather to their children, helping around the ranch when his health allowed. By 1890, Quentin had saved enough to buy his own land, a modest spread adjacent to the double bar. With Mr. Preston's blessing and Thomas's help, they built a larger house and started their own small ranch. It was everything Quentin had dreamed of, his own land, his own herd, and his family around him. Grace stood on the porch of their new house one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. Quentin came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. Their children were playing in the yard, their laughter carrying on the wind. Thomas sat in a rocking chair nearby, whittling a toy for James. "Happy," Quentin murmured in her ear. Grace leaned back against him, feeling the solid strength of his embrace. She thought about that terrified girl standing on the auction platform 12 years ago, certain her life was over. She thought about the cowboy who had ridden up and changed everything with a single bid. "More than I ever imagined possible," she said honestly. "You gave me my life back that day, Quentin, but more than that, you gave me a future worth living." "We gave each other that," Quentin corrected gently. "I was just existing before I met you, going through the motions. You gave me a reason to want more, to build something lasting. You made me believe I could have a real family, a real home." Grace turned in his arms to face him, reaching up to cup his weathered face in her hands. There were lines around his eyes now, silver threading through his dark hair, but to her, he was as handsome as the day she first saw him. "I love you, Quentin Parker. I love you, Grace Parker. Always have, always will." As they stood there in the fading light, surrounded by the life they had built together, Grace felt a profound sense of peace. The road from that auction platform to this moment had not always been easy, but every struggle had been worth it. She had found not just freedom that day, but love, partnership, and a family of her own. The shame and fear that had once defined her were distant memories now, replaced by the solid certainty of Quentin's love and the joy of the life they shared. The children called out that they were hungry, and the moment broke as Grace and Quentin laughed and headed inside to start supper. Thomas followed, regaling the children with another story from his trapping days. The house filled with noise and warmth and love, exactly as a home should be. Years continued to pass, bringing more joys and sorrows as life always does. Thomas passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1895, having spent his final years surrounded by the family he thought he had lost. Grace and Quentin mourned him but took comfort in knowing he had died happy, reconciled with his son and beloved by his grandchildren. The children grew up strong and capable. Thomas the younger became a fine rancher like his father, eventually taking over much of the daily operation of the ranch. Caroline proved to have a gift for horses even greater than Quentin's, and became known throughout the county for her ability to train even the most difficult animals. James surprised everyone by showing an aptitude for books and numbers, eventually becoming a teacher in the growing town of Wyatt, bringing education to a new generation. Grace and Quentin grew old together, their hair turning silver, their hands becoming gnarled with age and hard work. But their love never dimmed. Every evening, weather permitting, they would sit on their porch and watch the sunset, just as they had done for decades. Quentin would take Grace's hand and they would sit in comfortable silence, needing no words after so many years together. In the spring of 1912, as they celebrated their 33rd wedding anniversary, surrounded by their children, their grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren, Grace looked around the table at the family that had grown from that single act of courage and compassion so long ago. Quentin caught her eye and smiled, that same smile that had captured her heart all those years ago. That night, as they prepared for bed, Quentin pulled Grace into his arms. Despite their age, despite the aches and pains that came with years of hard work, she still felt safe and cherished in his embrace. "Do you ever think about that day?" he asked softly. "The day we met, sometimes," Grace admitted. "It feels like a lifetime ago, like it happened to different people." "In a way it did," Quentin said thoughtfully. "We have both changed so much, but I would do it all again in a heartbeat. Every moment, every hardship, everything that brought me to you." "As would I," Grace agreed. She thought about the girl she had been, powerless and afraid. She thought about the woman she had become, strong and loved and free. "You know what I think about most when I remember that day?" "What?" "How you looked at me. Not like I was property or a thing to be used, but like I was a person worthy of respect. You saw me, really saw me, when everyone else just saw something to be bought. That was the moment I started to fall in love with you, I think, before I even knew your name." Quentin tightened his arms around her. "I saw a woman with more courage than any 10 men I knew. I saw strength and dignity and grace, even in the worst circumstances. How could I not love you?" They stood there, holding each other, two people who had found each other against all odds and built a life that exceeded their wildest dreams. The ranch was quiet around them, their family safe and happy, their legacy secured. They had faced hardship and loss, joy and triumph, and through it all, they had faced it together. When Grace finally fell asleep that night, it was in Quentin's arms, where she had slept for over 3 decades. And when she dreamed, it was not of auction platforms or desperate fear, but of wide open prairies, of sunsets painting the sky, of 3 children laughing, of a life well lived and a love that had transformed everything. The cowboy had outbid everyone and set her free, but what he had really done was far more profound. He had seen her humanity when others saw only a commodity. He had offered her partnership when others would have demanded subservience. He had loved her not despite her circumstances, but because of the strength she showed in facing them. And in doing so, he had given her not just freedom, but a future filled with more love and happiness than she had ever imagined possible. That was the true gift, not the $500 or the rescue from the auction block, but the recognition of her worth as a human being and the love that grew from that recognition. It was a gift that lasted not just a moment or a day, but a lifetime, rippling out to touch their children and grandchildren and all the generations that would follow. In the end, Grace Sullivan, who became Grace Parker, lived to the remarkable age of 76, passing peacefully in 1934 with Quentin holding her hand. Her children gathered around her bed, and her grandchildren waiting just outside the room. She died knowing she was deeply loved, that her life had mattered, and that the legacy she and Quentin had built together would endure long after they were gone. Quentin followed her just 8 months later, his heart simply giving out one morning as he sat in his favorite chair on the porch, looking out over the land they had worked together for so many years. The family liked to think he had simply decided he could not bear to be without his Grace any longer, that he had gone to find her wherever souls go when they leave this earth. They were buried side by side in the cemetery in Wyatt, Missouri, the town where their story had begun on that dusty September day in 1878. Their headstone was simple, bearing their names, dates, and a single inscription chosen by their children. They found freedom in each other and love that lasted forever. And that was the truth of it, the heart of their story. 2 people who had every reason to be bitter and broken had instead chosen hope and love. A cowboy who could have ridden away after his good deed had instead stayed and built a life. A woman who could have let fear rule her had instead chosen to trust again. Together, they had created something beautiful and lasting, a testament to the power of compassion, courage, and love to transform even the darkest circumstances into something bright and good. Their story became something of a legend in their family, passed down through the generations. Great-grandchildren who never knew them still heard about the auction, and the cowboy who bid $500, about the little cabin and the ranch they built, about a love that weathered every storm. And in hearing it, they learned that sometimes the greatest acts of heroism are not flashy or dramatic, but simple acts of human decency offered at exactly the right moment to exactly the right person. That was the legacy of Grace and Quentin Parker, not just the land they accumulated or the children they raised, but the example they set of what love could be when it was built on respect, partnership, and genuine care for another person's well-being. In a time and place where women were often treated as property and men were valued primarily for their strength and dominance, they had forged a different path, one of equality and mutual support. And it all started with a cowboy looking up at a platform, seeing a woman in distress, and deciding that he would not let that injustice stand. $500 to change a life, to set someone free. But really, he had freed them both that day, freeing Grace from bondage and freeing himself from a solitary existence, opening the door to a future neither could have predicted but both would treasure for the rest of their days.